Hi, it's Kate from Atkins Photo Lab here, or Atkins Pro Lab, I suppose, given you guys are probably all professionals listening. I just wanted to go through with you a little bit about our album manufacturing process, and that's just to help clear up some confusion that we sometimes hear about around trim, bleed, and safe zones in album design. So a good way to start understanding these concepts is to start with how we actually manufacture an album. Now there are variations on this, like for instance if we do a hand torn edge it's slightly different, but this gives you a good idea of the process. So we start off with the page, which is exactly the size of your ordered album. So if you order a 10 by 10 inch album, you want your spread, your JPEG that you send us, whether you produce that in Smart Albums or Fundy or Photoshop, whatever, however you do it. We need it to be 10 inches, for a 10 inch album, 10 by 20 inches, right? And that needs to then have an allowance inside of that of 3mm bleed, or 0.118 of an inch is 3mm bleed. So once we've got that, we then put a score line in here. Now the score line is really important that it is a mechanically placed score line, and the reason you do that is it crushes the paper in a very consistent, neat way. If you just fold a piece of paper, you end up with this lumpy, weird shape in your score line, and what that does is actually crush the paper particles, the fibres in the paper in an uneven way, and that causes ink chipping, and that means that you end up having problems down the track with ink. So we always want to make sure that we put in a mechanical score line. It is actually placed by hand, but it is a little tool that places that score line. So once we've got this lovely fold in the middle of our page, we then essentially go through a process of putting these pages back to back for one page against the back of the other page, and that then glues all the pages to the album together. We don't do double-sided printing in albums. We're essentially putting them together back to back. So what we end up having is, this is page 1 and this is page 2 of a spread, and they are glued to page 3. This is the back of page 3 and page 4. So these two pages are put together with a substrate in there that sits in there, and that adheres the two pages together in a really strong bond, and you end up with page 1, page 2, back of this, page 3, page 4, right? So if we zip along and we do them all, we end up what we call the block, all the pages all glued together nicely and happily. Now I've done a very exaggerated drawing here just to show you how there can be slight variations in the way that the pages sit, and those variations are because we're sadly still human, haven't worked out how to stop being human, and these books are put together by hand. And even if you don't put them together by hand, the printing industry, as in offset printing, have major problems with this as well. And all printing really, where there's a lot of things all needing to line up together, there will always be minute little variations. And that's why bleed comes into play, because those tiny little variations in the way that each page sits together causes variations as to where the trim line is going to sit on each page. So this is our block. You can see we're going to trim off here and here. So instead of having all these higgledy-piggledy pages, we're going to have a lovely, neat, trimmed up, finished block. Now this is the spine. We don't want to trim that off, otherwise all the pages will fall apart and then you end up with individual prints. So this is a really good example on an actual layout, a design. So this is the design of the page. You can see here, and the page actually ends, the edge of the paper is here. And then you can see we've got our little trim line, which is that black line running there. That's where we aim to trim. And what we aim to do is to remove only that 3mm bleed, which is here. And the bleed means your image needs to run all the way off the edge of the page, right? It's bleeding all the way off the edge of the page. If you keep this design just say to here, when we trim, we might come in a little close on this side, and you might end up with a very fine little white line. So it's really important to run any images you want to look like they run off the edge of the page, you want them to run all the way off the edge of the paper through your bleed. And that brings us to our safe zone issue. The safe zone is a design aspect. So it's similar to bleed in that you want to have designs clear of this area. So this design here, you can see the image ends here, and that's brilliant because you don't want to have an image in this space. And for our album specifications, that safe zone is 1 centimetre or about half an inch. And that is really important so that when we trim, if we have any variation within this bleed zone, and the bleed really, it's this side, but it's also a little bit this side, right? And the reason is going back to these little higgledy-piggledy pages, you have little variations. And when the design is trimmed up, you don't want to see those variations. So when we actually trim it, you can see here, you could have a design which, is very close to the edge of the page, and I'll show you this in Smart Albums in a sec. Very close to the edge of the page. When it's trimmed, even if there's only a tiny little variation, and you can see this area here is the paper, right? And this is what we've trimmed off. You can see there's a tiny little shift. It's a little bit on an angle, and because this design is so close to the edge of the page, to the bleed area in its safe zone, it's way into the safe zone. That is then showing that slight variation very dramatically with this white line going from thin to thick at the end there. Now this is the same exact variation in angle, so there is a slight variation in angle, but because this is a really wide border, you can't see as easily that there's a problem. And again, these are exaggerations purely to demonstrate the problem, because if you design your album like this, where there's a very small little edge on it, you then are leaving an opportunity for this disaster to happen. And from our perspective, we would never allow this to leave the lab. This is not appropriate. We would contact you and say, hey, can you work on your design so that it's more like this, so that this is not something that we end up presenting to you, because your clients will not be happy with that, and we're not happy with that. And you wouldn't be happy with it either. You would be returning it. So we try to make it so that you can really succeed with your album straight up. So in Smart Albums, which is one of our preferred suppliers for album design, we really want to show you where this is and how you can fix this in your design. So these are 2 spreads. These are just spreads I've dumped into Smart Albums. Normally you'd have all your individual images displaying along here. This is just for demonstration purposes. So if you've done a design in Smart Albums and you want to change the way it works, you want to make things bigger or smaller or whatever, you double click on the spread and it brings you into this little area here. You've got this ruler along here and you've got these little panels and blah, blah, blah. So what you can see here is that's your bleed line, right? That little red line, that's where we're going to trim. And so between here and here, the edge of the page, that's the bleed that we aim to trim off. Now, Smart Albums have their safe zone is 3 mil again, which just isn't enough, I believe, and I will be writing to them and requesting that they make it deeper for our specifications. And we really want that ½ inch or 1 centimetre in from the design. And you can see this little icon here shows you where things are going to be trimmed off, and you flick it again and you can see your bleed. So you can see the bleed, the file comes off. You don't have to worry about this. If you just use Smart Albums standard templates and you never double click and come into this area and change things, you don't have to worry about this. Smart Albums knows this is a problem. They don't allow designs with very thin borders on them, and so it's really not a problem unless you do that double click and you want to alter the design of the template specifically to your needs, which you totally can do. You just need to be aware that from that red line into where your design starts, you want to have 1 centimetre or a ½ inch in there. So when we go back, you can see that when you've got that a centimetre, ½ inch here, it's not a problem. When it's less, it is a problem. So that's the stuff you really want to think about when it comes to album design. the edge of the paper, the trim line, the bleed, and the safe zone. They're the most important elements in terms of making sure that when your album is produced, it's perfect and easy and it flies through the lab with no trouble, and you're not having us ring you and go, there was a problem. If any of this is confusing, please contact us. We love talking to people. We'd happily have a chat to you about it and go through it again. I hope that this was somewhat useful. Thanks.